Thank you for tuning back into Acid Horizon. Today we have Thomas Nail back on the show to talk about his book, The Philosophy of Movement. But before we get going, just two announcements. You already know about Acephalus, the Kickstarter campaign that we have launched to fund our book for next year. Go to the show notes, hit the Kickstarter link right at the very top, and support us if you haven't already. And if you have, just want to say thank you. Also, very important, if you are listening to this during the first week of November in 2024, on November 9th, we will be in Brooklyn with famed translator Stuart Kendall at Public Records for the Durations Festival. Acid Horizon will be hosting his talk, The Headless Politics of George Bataille. We absolutely want you to come if you are based in New York City or if you can come into town. Entry will be $10, but you can also pick up a ticket for the entire festival, which I will put into the links, and see great artists like Andy Stott and many other artists who are participating in the festival. So, two things: support the Acephalus Kickstarter, and we will see you in Brooklyn on Saturday, November 9th. Just navigate to the show notes for more details. Now, here's Thomas Nail and the Philosophy of Movement.
Love's got the world in motion, so said New Order on their 1996 European Football Championship hit of the same name. And continuing on this theme of motion, we are once again joined by Thomas Nail to talk about his latest book, The Philosophy of Movement and Introduction. You may remember Thomas from our previous episodes on Lucretius and, of course, the kinetic reading of Marx, drawing from his original dissertation thesis. But today we're going to talk about everything motional. We're going to talk about new materialisms. We're going to be talking about time. We're going to be talking about everything in reevaluating the concept of keeping things moving. Thomas, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to talk to you guys again. Thanks for having me.
So this book really is a summary of, well, a sort of a development of a hell of a lot of work. I mean, as Daniel W. Smith says in the foreword, this is possibly like at least the 11th or 12th, possibly even further on, numbers of books you've done on this topic, applying motion to everything from a reinterpretation of Marxist materialism to understandings of migration, and even to the insurrectionary potentials of a new politics. So I just wanted to ask, really, starting off in terms of your reevaluation of the concept of movement. So how have we historically, in the dominantly sort of Western philosophical tradition, understood movement, and what kind of assumptions have shaped this history?
Yeah, so that's the question that sort of got me started. And I don't think I realized how deep this was going to take me. I thought it was just like a one-off question of like, oh, it's just one of those things. Philosophers write a paper about some concept in history. And then I just pulled on this string and just the whole carpet just unraveled. And I ended up spending the last decade just working on all the different questions that came out of this. But the short answer is that I was really surprised to see how much nearly universally the Euro-Western tradition is committed to explaining movement by something with something that doesn't move, which is to say, kind of explaining it away. And that was a surprise to me. I thought, well, what's wrong with movement? Why does it need to be explained away? I mean, other things aren't explained away usually, like time and space. Nobody's trying to explain those away. They're trying to give accounts of them, but usually accounts that validate them, their existence. But movement, it was a weird one because it seemed like all the explanations invalidated its existence almost. And let me tell you what I mean. I mean, when the search, for example, of like ontological first principles, like with the Greeks, like the early stories of the early Greek philosophers are that the world is essentially this kind of cosmic sphere, and it moves around to some degree, but at the center is this thing that doesn't move. Because it's a sphere, the middle is the piece that never changes and never moves. And so stasis is the sort of cosmological center that everything is based on. And that in other variations, for Aristotle, for example, the unmoved mover. it doesn't move. That's the point of it. Or he tries to, there's a part of it that moves and part of it doesn't move. But the point is, some part of it, at least some part, the Greek word is akinetos. It doesn't move. There's no other translation of that word, akinetos. It just doesn't move. But this is like, the same with Descartes, who looks for unquestionably unchanging first principles, referring to sort of Archimedes. If there's a lever that you have, a point that doesn't change, then you can have a lever that can move the world. And even Einstein himself really was committed to the idea that, first of all, God doesn't play dice. So it's a kind of totally deterministic sort of system, but also that the universe it's explainable with laws of physics, universal laws. And I mean, that was his aspiration, and is the aspiration of much of the history of physics and science, is that there are universal laws of nature that do not change. But their goal in their non-changingness is to explain everything that does change, namely everything in the phenomenal world that we experience, that we experiment on, can be explained by unchanging universal principles, constants of nature that do not change. But in that way, I was like, well, why can't it just change without there being some other fundamental static principle? And that's what really got me going. And I wondered how deep that was. And so it's taken quite a few books to figure out that's pretty deep. That's really deep. I believe that that's the fundamental commitment of Euro-Western civilization and thinking, is to explain away movement, to explain it by something that doesn't move, whether that be God, unmoved movers, universal rational principles of science, but something that can give us a foundation that won't change.
This one of the things I appreciate most in the beginning of the book is particularly because it resonates with something I say a lot when I try to explain one of the sort of core Deleuzian points of identity being a metastability of difference, which is I always use the example of the cosmos, trying to find what's the stable point that means a day is a day. Well, okay, we say a day is one rotation of the Earth, or I say a year is one rotation of the Earth around the sun, but then the solar system is moving, so you broaden it out. You say, well, okay, relative to the galaxy is moving, okay, relative to clusters, okay, the clusters are moving, okay, relative to the universe, okay, the universe is expanding. It's like, well, it's slowing down a bit. No, it's accelerating. And what I really also appreciate is there have been various kinds of ways to philosophize movement as such, or something that breaks away from all stability as a kind of end of philosophy, or sort of where philosophy doesn't go any further. I'm thinking of, to be honest, Max Stirner, or someone like George Bataille in the theory of base matter, as sort of an end to knowledge. And it seems like the approach really to actually give an account of it sort of in itself without actually sort of fleeing away from the act of philosophy as such. And there's definitely a political import here, if you don't mind me saying. It seems like there's kind of almost an ontological anarchy in a very sort of sense that someone like Catherine Malibu would use it. And I wanted to ask how sort of the prejudice against, let's say, something like movement in favor of fixity or indeterminacy, how that feeds into the kind of political functioning of a lot of the philosophy which sees movement as something to be, in a way, it erects its hierarchies of the static above the fluid or the flowing.
Wow, yeah, that's a big question. And I've written a bunch of political books, so I'm going to try to answer that in a short way, even if maybe it'll sound a little bit abstract. But the general in the Euro-Western tradition, you have a great chain of being. Sorry, back to Aristotle, even though he didn't exactly call it that. But there's a kind of built-in natural hierarchy of things. And this hierarchy, of course, has aesthetic, political, historical. It has all of these, expressions. But since your question is about politics, we'll emphasize that. In the great chain of being, the things that are on the top of that chain are things like the unmoved mover and form. And the things that are on the bottom of that chain are things like matter and movement. And in a very short section in Aristotle's Metaphysics, he basically said, I don't have that much to say about protehule or prime matter. That's because there's nothing to say. He says it's a logon. You can't use the logos to talk about it. It's a oriston. It's got no limits. It's unbounded. It's indeterminate. And he's just like, we can't do anything with this. This is like not a workable thing because it doesn't have a form. We can't give it a definition. We can't even think it. There's nothing that we can do with this. And yet somehow he seems to acknowledge that this is a thing, but it's at the very bottom. It is that sort of base of the great chain of being. He also says that, so because it's constantly sort of changing and indeterminate, it has a connection to change and movement. So things that are always changing and becoming, they are historic, they're sort of in the natural hierarchy. And from a political perspective, things that are inferior to those that are on top. So, for example, one of the justifications in Aristotle's Politics that he gives for basically treating non-Greeks as potential slaves, natural potential slaves, is that they're always moving around. They don't have the polis, so they're too mobile. If they would have settled down, maybe they could have a polis. And the other problem is they don't speak Greek. That just means they're sort of cut off from the use of reason, and they're not going to be able to politically communicate with the use of reason. So they don't have the logos. Again, this is sounding awfully familiar, something that doesn't have the logos, the logon of indeterminate matter. Now, he doesn't call them indeterminate matter, but essentially he's putting them increasingly in that category at the very bottom of the great chain of being. So although people like, George Bush and Donald Trump and all kinds of, leaders around the world, although they don't read Aristotle, they certainly are invoking a certain implicit great chain of being when they say things, like, immigrants are essentially sort of like natural servants in the capitalist mode of production that can be hyper exploited. They're always moving around. And so they're not really capable of political voice or action. So when undocumented migrants in California sung the US national anthem in Spanish, George Bush says, that's not the national anthem. It can't be, because it wasn't in English. But there's that kind of same Aristotelian prejudice. They don't have the logos. They can't really engage in politics. When they sing a political song, it can't be political because they don't have political status, because they're not singing it in the right way and they don't have the rights political. Anyway, the point is that historically peoples who we can look, another axis we could think about would be racialization and blackness. Blackness is on the very bottom of the great chain of being, and it always has been. And light is above. Things that are dead also, or close to death, as Lucretius says. He says rich people think about poor people as being close to the gates of death. And that proximity to death is important because it places it again toward the very bottom. It's like dead matter. It's sort of indeterminate, moving around. And so the people or animals or whatever that are like that are also on the bottom of the great chain of being. And therefore, they're just kind of this natural material lacking in proper form that needs to be given the proper form of course, reason, the state, capital. It depends on your historical period, what needs to be, given its proper form. So, so we could look at all kinds of groups of people, but there's a general political subordination of folks close to that bottom. And I'm not committed, contrary to what it might sound like, all this stuff about movement and materialism, I'm not committed to those as like kind of absolute terms, like, we've got to think about the word matter because I'm a materialist or something like that. At a certain level, I don't care what the word is that we're using, but because we live in a certain historical time period that I'm living in this world where those are the words that have been sort of put on the bottom of the great chain of being and mobilized against huge portions of humanity. In that way, there's a political decision to choose the words matter and movement. That may be given different histories, and even histories prior to 6th century BCE. I could explain why that number in particular, but in other time periods and geographies, those just words wouldn't have the same meaning as they do for us now. So I'm committed to them in a kind of historical, political way. And suspicious in some ways of anything that's higher than that on the great chain of being historically, lightness, white, Michel Serres gets going a little bit crazy, starts talking about a white ontology. And I'm like, I get what he's talking about, like white noise and all that stuff. But come on, we don't need a white ontology. You can't just talk about white ontology during a mass historical period of like white supremacy. You know what I'm saying? It's a little tone deaf and ahistorical to just think that you could rehabilitate white ontology in this context. So anyway, that's a long answer, but it's a messy question.
I think it goes straight to one of the axes of the sort of primary ethical commitments of your book, which you find on like page 2 or 3. I have the Kindle edition, so the pagination's probably off. But, is that movement, especially from Aristotle to Aquinas, which really starts to be sort of the foundational articulation of this chain of being, which gets formalized not so much in Pseudo-Dionysius, which we like to think, but actually really in Aquinas, in the church, in these very political institutions, starts to be an account of like what is derivative and what is passive, right? To what you said about slavery and the exclusion from the polis, the way in which the body of the slave moves is fundamentally different from the way in which the body of the political male moves, in as much as the political male has that sort of non-crude movement, that kinetics of reason, where one's work is within themselves, right? The famous Spartan dialogue where it's like, okay, well, why do you have slaves to take care of your crops when you can so clearly take care of them yourselves? And then, the Spartan oligarch goes, well, because we prefer to take care of ourselves. And
Right.
so this idea that there has to be, because in De Anima, what is it that doesn't move? It's the soul of reason. That does not move. And the unmoved mover, these aren't just questions of causality, which we've sort of flattened them to say, oh, well, this is Aristotle trying to give, or this is Aquinas trying to give, or this is Augustine. These are immediately, the question of that we live is immediately bound up with how we live, how we move. And this idea that natural hierarchies are merely byproducts of these more fundamental principles are, I think, some of that starts to fall apart just in like a 5-second critical analysis of really just the tone of works like De Anima, the physics, especially the politics, especially book 1 and book 2, where the political animal is really an animal of a particular kind of motion. And I'm wondering if you could give us sort of an analysis of the European or Western tradition of its relationship to movement, and how this sort of metaphysics of movement helps inform not just the politics of this specific book, which I think you immediately get in the account of industrialization and the use of historical process by the domination over nature and over the way it moves. But how do these more fundamental questions at the level of like a metaphysics, how does it inform sort of the entirety of this inquiry?
Yeah, so there's kind of, this is actually a two-sided question. The first one is, why is the Euro West so absolutely committed to explaining motion by something that doesn't move? And then the flip side is, well, because they use that, as you say, as a justification for pretty much everything. Like, why would we invent a science of universal principles and laws? That's an invention. Historically, that has not existed forever. It doesn't have to exist, but it got invented. Why? You know what I'm saying? Like, but it's related to a certain kind of cosmology or an ontological commitment that the world yields itself and has universal things. And part of that's kind of a theological commitment too by early modern European sciences that were like, yeah, well, God makes the rules. We just learn them, and so we'll learn those universal laws and so on. So it commits them. That's the first question that I was like kind of trying to figure out of like, why are they so committed to this? And of course, some of those answers are, as you say, fundamental questions about really ontology. If there is a God who sort of, isn't in this world, that means that he's not subject to the laws of becoming and change and so on. And if that's the case, then and his laws and so on are going to be also sort of universal, eternal, and unchanging. So the commitment to discovering those, it just shapes the entire tradition and politically aspirations of utopia and perfect societies governed by the laws of God, or by a king who talked to God and figure out what those laws were, or scientists who studied real hard and learned the laws of God and so on, or science depending on the time period. In any case, that's one project, is just figuring out what they've done in the name of trying to explain movement away as secondary. And that even occurs even when it sounds like that's not what's going on. in the case of like time or space, we think like, oh, well, time and space, that's not like theological commitment or something like that. I think it really is. Time and space are other ways of explaining away a movement by something that movement happens inside of them. So what's primary in the story, for instance, of time, is that time is primary. Ontologically, there's just something called time. And then movement happens as a transformation of position in time. So we think about mostly movement as like from point A to point B, but that assumes there's a point, something called A, which is self-identical, and it's different in space than point B, and that there's some kind of temporal difference in the transition from point A to point B. But what that definition of motion tells you is that the world isn't fundamentally in motion. The world is fundamentally spatiotemporal, and then things move around in that, or appear to move relative to the space-time framework. So that puts space and time primary. So again, you don't necessarily, it doesn't need to be theological directly and talking about God or some kind of spherical cosmos. We really just emphasizing the primacy of space-time itself as fundamental is a way of saying that movement isn't. And you might be thinking, yeah, but isn't that general relativity, Thomas? Like, I thought that was correct. Everything is space-time. What the hell are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about, we can't get into it too far, but quantum gravity, which is to say the quantum realm is energy is space and time are not things. They are energy that is active at the quantum level. Quantum activity of energy produces a metastable state, which is space-time. So space-time is, again, the theories of this, there's about 10 working hypotheses about how we get space-time out of energy. But most physicists are in agreement that this is the project to work on, unifying quantum physics with general relativity. They believe that they will get there. I hope there will be some experiments that will help them get some actually demonstrable experimental evidence about these theories. But that's the project. And most physicists agree that that's the case. Otherwise, you have to explain the emergence of space-time essentially out of nothing. That can't be true. It's not going to pop out of nothing. That's theological for sure. So anyway, those are some other answers that you could get to the question in Western history. The other side of everything is if that's not what's actually going on, and these are metaphysical stories being told about what's happening, then what's actually happening? From the perspective, if everything's moving around, like, why would we believe otherwise? How could we believe otherwise? What are the conditions for possibility of believing otherwise? And that's what all these patterns are that I spent, just the last decade sort of finding and thinking, are these things actually here? Why do I keep finding them over and over again? And this book is the first place where I've really put all those together. I kept finding these patterns of, sort of where things gather together and then spread out, sort of centripetal patterns socially, where that's predominant, like in the Neolithic, centrifugal patterns where things seem to be oriented around a central point and then radiate. So these are social and aesthetic and scientific, all these patterns. But I finally, in this book, figured out that these patterns, and it took writing Theory of the Earth, and I was like, oh my God, it's a meta pattern. These patterns all fit together in one big branching meta pattern. And then I was like, okay, this kind of like wraps up the whole project, and it helps give a lot of explanation for how it is that that in art and politics and science and ontology, that people could give explanations for something that are metaphysical, like what are the patterns they have to do? There are real patterns of motion that are at work producing the conditions under which the world might seem like it's explainable by universal laws, gods, causality, all kinds of metaphysical things, space-time even, and so on. So it's a long-winded answer, but that's kind of the whole book project.
The whole articulation of passivity in this book I was like, yes, finally, I'm not crazy when I read Aristotle, and I'm like, this is all just the treatment of passivity here is a kind of treatment of inferiority, where it's levels of movability that determines where on this actually instantiated and practiced chain of being, not just the causal chain of being with God and the angels, but in fact, like the polis and the oikos, it's this relationship between superiority and impassivity. And to sort of get that just so cleanly articulated within like the first 10 or 20 pages of this book is so helpful. But yeah, that's just me whining because I've taken too many Aristotle classes now.
I find it incredibly interesting how, in a way, and this is because, this is me as a guy who reads way too much Immanuel Kant, just how the book is attempting, the method is attempting to sidestep this problem of the transcendental, which just tries to, we always have to work backwards from an assumed stability of experience in order to find the root principles which make that possible. And in a way, it kind of sidesteps the kind of move that, or at least not sidestep, sorry, critiques the historical presuppositions and assumptions of sidesteps and suggests there isn't work here, but there is a hell of a lot. That sort of makes the modern, what we might call modern European philosophy as a post-Kantian discourse kind of possible, and that includes everyone from Hegel, even later to Deleuze as an anti-Hegelian. And it seems, it's really coming out of this, what we describe as going along with someone like Karen Barad, and really just trying to not extract the laws from quantum physics, but actually read the experiments in the strictest way possible. And one of the main concepts you get out of quantum physics is the thing which Einstein found so offensive. I mean, people forget that when he says God doesn't play dice with the universe, that was in sort of a protest to say that he wasn't saying as, God doesn't play dice with the universe. He was saying, mein God does not play dice with the universe. He was kind of screaming it at the first presentations of quantum physics. I mean, this really all ties around really to a certain debate over the nature of indeterminacy, and a way that sort of that arrives when you strip away these Kantian qualities, by which I mean, listeners, stripping away the idea of a certain a priori, something that precedes experience about matter. There's kind of a radical empiricism to this, which I don't think, as you do just distance yourself from Deleuze, is not simply a transcendental one. But one of the things I just want to ask to get into, or rather than sort of the critique of classical theories of motion, to get into your theories of motion itself, I'd like to just ask a little bit about particularly this concept of indeterminacy, because when people typically think of processes of motion, historically philosophers of motion have seen it as, kind of like a series of like pictures, almost like a cinematic image in itself, where you have a sequence of static images or snapshots in themselves, change just kind of posited as being just the thing that fills in the gaps. But for you, indeterminacy, rather than being a space kind of that has to be philosophized away or represents kind of the absence of philosophical determination, actually becomes a philosophical, I don't say principle or even object, but a field in which philosophy can happen for itself. Can we get into the concept of indeterminacy?
Of what that is. It's very difficult to talk about it. It's a very weird concept, and certainly not a major one in the history of Euro-Western thought. But for me, that's why somebody like Lucretius and the Swerve is so important, because he's one of the few who sort of made it inside the canon to some degree, but with this crazy idea that nobody was on board with until Marx. And Marx is like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. But before that, nobody believed. Like, what do you mean it just swerves, In any case, but that's indeterminacy. So if there are sort of three sort of core features of at least the process philosophy that I'm proposing. And, one of the chapters in the book is kind of just saying, here's what's different about mine. It's close. I take great inspiration, and it's very close to people like Bergson, Deleuze, Whitehead. Yes, but there's differences. And one of those differences, you're right to note, is indeterminacy. So the key terms are indeterminate, relational, process. And I try to define those right away in the book, just so that it's clear what I'm trying to mean by those, but that doesn't make them easy to explain. So indeterminacy, like you said, for me, this does come from, where to start with indeterminacy? I'm trying to think where to begin that conversation. Maybe we could start by just saying this at a basic level, it's the thing that's different. So for Whitehead, you're right. It's like, it's a strobe. Like the processes are happening. It's like he says in the text that there's no such thing as movement. People are like, oh, Whitehead's a process philosopher. Yeah, but he totally rejects movement, right? I mean, what kind of process is that without movement? Well, it's a strobe one, where everything flashes into being, disappears, and then flashes again. And this is exactly what Bergson didn't like. Bergson's like, it's not like a projector. He's like, that's not what I'm talking about. There was, Bertrand Russell had a similar idea about change, meaning that it's like this strobing, flashing, discontinuous. And the term was Cambridge change for the philosophers of Cambridge who subscribed to this particular idea of discontinuous change. On the other hand, there's Bergson, where he rejects the discontinuities and he affirms instead continuities. And he says a change is continuous. And there are places where he's not totally in his vocabulary consistent across all of his works, but there are places where he is very explicit that he's talking about continual change, unbroken continual change. And Deleuze is a kind of a mix of both. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says, Whitehead's book, Process and Reality, is like the best book ever. Toward the end in Difference and Repetition, he really admires Whitehead and is a reader of him. At the same time, he really admires Bergson. And he kind of like basically brings together this kind of meta process philosophy tradition. He's like, we can have both. We can have continuous change and we can have discontinuous change. We can have qualitative and quantitative. And so then that's why there's all these kinds of sometimes he'll say weird stuff about stasis. And I have to say, I just kind of read over those when I read Deleuze. It's like, well, I'm sure he means continuous. He's just being playful somehow. But I've grown to see, in my reading at least, that he really does want both. That's why in Anti-Oedipus, there's the ham slicer, the flows that then they get cut. And then the flows are attached again. It's like flow, cut, flow, cut, flow, cut. I was like, I just thought this was all playful at the time. But I think now that it's really Deleuze trying to kind of unify and synthesize an ultimate process philosophy that brings both together. So there's three positions so far: discontinuous with Whitehead, continuous with Bergson, and then Deleuze, who's like both and. There is, however, a fourth option that I've tried to carve out here, and I can't think of any sort of other versions of this in the history of philosophy, although again, some get very close, is indeterminate process. That one is tricky because we're not talking about substances, okay? We're not talking about continuous or discontinuous. We're talking about process still, but processes can be continuous or discontinuous or both, or they can just not be continuous or discontinuous. They can be indeterminate. And this is not just some abstract fourth option in some logical procedure. It's also, I'm getting it from quantum physics, the experiments. And like you said, I'm not giving an interpretation of quantum physics. That's not my goal. And the physicists that I like are people like, Carlo Rovelli. In his book, he has a whole chapter in Helgoland where he's like, these are interpretations of quantum physics. Here's what he just walks you through the experiment of the double slit. And he's like, this is what the experiment shows. Here are all the interpretations. All these interpretations try to explain away the experimental result. And I find that very helpful and honest in a way that most physicists are happy to give you an explanation or an interpretation of what that result means. But Rovelli's like, well, the result is indeterminacy. That's what the result is. That doesn't take any interpretation. You just don't know where the electron is going to go. It can go all over the place. The distributions are not fully predictable. We can't know in advance with certainty. It's not deterministic. So in many ways, indeterminacy is sort of like a negative characterization a little bit. It's not determinate. But that, of course, does raise the question, well, then what is it? And the answer is, it's not. It's not a thing. But, the language that we have to talk about ontology is so circumscribed by Indo-European language structures. And so it's like almost impossible. You want to know what it is, but what if it's not an is? What if it's not a being? What if it's a process? So that's why I find indeterminacy and process, like becoming, they're sort of a natural fit for one another. If you have to say something positive about indeterminacy, you could say it's process. But again, you might wonder what's being processing. And then again, you're just asking for metaphysical substance kinds of answers. And I'm really not wanting to give those substance-based answers. And I hold to the experimental result without interpretation and just say, look, and also I just want to say, maybe I'm wrong. Because this is an experimental result to some degree, although there's lots of historical stuff, which is the next project that precursors to all of this that's worth looking into. The experimental result is almost a kind of negative one, which is you can't have an equation that predicts this with certainty. So I'm trying to stick with that and say, well, what if there will be no experiment that will prove this wrong? That's just where we're at. No experiment has shown that quantum indeterminacy does not exist. There are interpretations that try to explain why it shouldn't or can't or won't or doesn't, but none that experimentally predict the outcomes in a way that would invalidate indeterminacy. So the question is open. What if the world just is fundamentally indeterminate? Now, again, it's a question. I'm not like committing to that and like, if it's, I know that it is because I talked to God or thought real hard or something, like I'm not saying that. If there's an experiment that proves me wrong, then I'm screwed and my philosophy is rubbish, But until then, I'm going to run with it and see how far we can go. And that's what's historical about the ontology that I'm proposing is it could be wrong. I could very much be wrong. And yeah, I mean, I sort of hope not, but I'd rather know that it would be wrong. But until then, I'm going to stick with it and I'm going to resist any form of interpretation of quantum physics and just be like, this is what the experiment shows. Let's just assume this is what's going on.
That's a lot better than Kantians who are like, look at this neurology that just came out. It's so close to what Kant was saying in the B deduction. And all of those folks who are like, were Kant around today, he would be in a psychology department. I was like, what? So there is this whole element of the history of ontology, which is attempting to sort of dance around physics as, or frankly, movement as something that needs to either be papered over or treated as merely an object of conjecture, like almost a theological kind of conjecture. And that's sort of what I appreciate about this, because you can have thinkers as disparate as like Epicurus and Heidegger, thousands of years apart, both of whom say like, oh, movement sits at the core, kinesis sits at the core of this thing anyway, and it's the inability to meditate on it, not just to constitute it or to give it some sort of composite substance, which of course, like everyone agrees is impossible, right? Even Aristotle's doctrine on sleep has to rely on movement, but the ability to at least put forward a meditation on it is, I think, just in the sense of a desire to allow oneself to be subject to this thing is historical. I think in that pure sense, which is not to say, oh, you're being extremely humble. Like, I can't wait for you to be disproven in 100 years. but just the fact that it is a first meditation. I mean, an introduction truly is the adequate subtitle.
I also want to say that insofar as sort of what the stakes are of this project in terms of what you're using as sort of the basic evidence, it's the very thing we're using right now to talk. You say communication technologies rely on a kind of, essentially the calculations inaugurated by a contemporary model we have of quantum physics. And whilst ultimately any sort of disproving would have to happen on the level of, refuting someone like Heisenberg and rendering something determinate, so far empirically, it's unable otherwise to. I mean, for example, in the book you say, it's a quote, in short, several quantum experiments have shown that you cannot take a perfect snapshot of energy because it does not have a determinate location or determinate properties. It is a pattern in process field of fluctuations. In other words, as a process, energy is not identical to itself. And this is what the indeterminacy of matter and motion means. And this lack of identity here, I mean, you affirm whole hand that identity is always a shorthand. And so it's in a way, if there is anything transcendental here, the transcendental is itself a kind of habit. And I easily use this to think about, for example, how Deleuze and Guattari think about the I or the state. The Urstadt is kind of similar to the self because it's just a pattern that happens in a repeated place. We end up accreting it into something that seems stable in particular. I mean, there's also an additional thing that your philosophy of motion changes, which is the concept of relation, particularly in terms of, because typically we think of relation as a kind of movement between fixed relata, indeed, the point stretching from A to B. But at one point in the book, you do say that relations do not designate a matrix of total possible positions, a static or even relativistic space and time. if we rethink about your concept of indeterminacy here, you define a relation as, quote, a degree of simultaneous reciprocal change in an open process. Relations are integral to the constitution and transformation of things. And so with this new sort of philosophical language of movement, one that subtracts the concepts of substance, essence, and object in favor of, say, flows, fields, and the third one escapes me. I believe folds, but maybe I'm importing too much Deleuze there. There we go.
No.
How does this change the concept of relation, which in a way has been so central to modern European philosophy? I mean, after Kant, Kant's categories, quantity, quality, relation, modality. I know you do indeed reread all of those in the book, but say for all the people that come afterwards, like the German idealists, they take relation as the one that really matters when they run with what Kant did. So how do you sort of reframe or rephrase the concept of relation beyond simply being a canvas in which relata are situated?
Yeah, that's a good one. So if energy is indeterminate, it means that we don't have fixed relata. So it means that there's a kind of constant transformation of the whole cosmos. And that's difficult to think, I think, in part because we sort of live in a world of where like causality kind of helps us make sense of a bunch of things, even if we don't believe in it metaphysically. We're like, yeah, things do seem to have some habitual patterns, things do seem to cause one another. It's easy to forget that that when things change, they all change together, even if they don't seem related. And what I'm thinking of here is the findings of quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement, even if it's not a very useful concept in the sense of like, yeah, how does it change your life to know that electrons in your body are simultaneously changing in coordination with electrons light years away? It doesn't really alter what I'm going to have for lunch or something like that. But what it does mean is it should alter the way that we think about everything in the cosmos changing, meaning that in the very beginning, if we're dealing with something like a pre-Big Bang moment of energy, which is so indeterminate in its character that it's not yet even produced space and time, when it explodes and moves outward, it's like even spatial designations don't make sense for what happens at the Big Bang because it's the production of space and time itself. What's going on is all of that energy remains entangled. It doesn't not become entangled anymore. It still is, and it's going to keep being entangled, again, to varying degrees and concentrations and so on. But it's the relative concentrations and regional locations of entanglement, higher degrees or weaker degrees of entanglement that produce the matrix of the cosmos. So its relation is like, I don't know, it's a weird idea. I mean, there's no outside of it. I mean, there's no separate things to get related. There's no relata. There's no separate thing to call a relation. Like the entire cosmos is completely and totally entangled, such that all you can say is, I think Bergson probably gets the closest when he says the kind of the qualitative transformation of the open whole of the universe. There's just continual ongoing change in these entangled patterns. Now, he didn't know about quantum entanglement, but that's a very key feature. So it's not just change, it's also things are changing together in a quantumly entangled state. So that's sort of at least the experimental basis for thinking about relation from an indeterminate perspective, because there's not some total of things in the universe either, in part because you have genuine quantum indeterminacy. Particles are metastable states in that world. And so their metastabilities become entangled, but they can sort of change entanglements. So I don't know if that helps answer. I mean, that's kind of a very big macroscopic answer to the question of what indeterminate relations would be. But indeterminate relations are they're not between things. It's just the changing of everything in the universe together along in apparently coordinated patterns. The change of the entire universe in coordinated patterns. Yeah, there we go.
I mean, it's a macrocosmic question. It does. Don't worry about that in terms of we are only talking about life, the universe, and everything. So, but I mean, in terms of I have a philosophical question, I guess, in relation to this. I did want to ask just very quickly about time, because one of the things I find fascinating is that in your account, time and space are emergent properties of motion itself, and this is a great attack on the Kantian formula, which people like everyone after Kant, especially Deleuze, love as well, which is the detachment of time from motion. Is a great sort of reversal or attack against Aristotle. And I'd like to ask about time. No, towards the end of the book, it was sort of halfway through actually, in the section called Modernity, you talk about this sea change and how we think about time. But as sort of a follow-up, I want to ask about this in relation to a concept of history. Of course, the great philosopher of that most people are thinking of right now is probably going to be someone like Hegel. And there's a thesis around history which you articulate. I think we've spoken about before, but I just wanted to get it again here, really, which is that history is not something that happens in time, but rather that time happens through historical events. So history is moving, events are moving, and actually this theory of time takes away that even history itself as a static canvas. Can we get into that?
Yeah. So one of my favorite books on this is Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time. It's a short book, highly recommend. But I mean, it's his position is, it was sort of already my position before reading it, so of course I liked it. But the idea is that, especially if you come from a quantum perspective, space and time are emergent properties. It means that the directionality of the universe, the directionality of time and, the universe it's the second law. I mean, it's entropy. The reason why that we give a name to this kind of thing is because energy is going from a high concentrated state to a much more spread out, lower concentrated state. That's just what's going on as far as we know. Again, there could be anomalies in certain regions. This doesn't have to be some kind of universal commitment forever and all time. But as far as we know at this point in this universe, this is the thing that's going on, is entropy. And that is the spreading out. The spreading out of energy produces all of these patterns. It produces something like the directionality of time. But another important consequence of a materialist theory of time is that the past and the present, they're not like abstractions, on some line that we have to posit in the future, like there's actually a place called the future. The past and the present are both like all the matter that's going to happen is here already, and everything that has happened. I mean, so it ends up in weird kind of, I guess, ways of thinking about things. Like we're all not just Carl Sagan, we're all star stuff, but like we're all deeply 13.8 billion years old. I mean, the energy of our bodies is that old, but that's as old as everything is at this point, right? I mean, like everything it's all still as old as the universe when it first started, just not in this particular form, but the energy was all there. So the past, the deep, deep past, the terrestrial past, the cosmic past is contained inside the material present. And so it's not like the past is some hypothetical, cinematic frame that we could go back and like take a slice out of or something like that. It is the present. But of course, this mixes together, of course, the past, present, and future in a way that undermines their kind of abstract distinction in time, which is very important for Kant, because that's just how he defines time, is the sequence of nows. And of course, that's a cinematic definition of time. It's also sort of just, I think, deeply wrong about how time works, because he has no experimental evidence that he's dealing with here. He's just conjecture. He's just thinking really hard about the nature of time. But in terms of physical experiments, there's no observation of the past as a slice of something. It's all still here. But that only makes sense from a materialist perspective. And of course, Kant has an idealist orientation in which we're dealing with, ideal transcendental structures, ideal forms of space and time, and not actual material ones that have anything to do with entropy or certainly with movement. But also I would just quickly define, when I say movement, again, I'm sort of picking words relative to the Euro-Western tradition, but to me, movement, matter, energy, indeterminacy, these are more or less the same thing. There's not like some big ontological difference between those. I don't think of them as like you could pull them out and say, well, the difference between matter and movement is this. We're really at a certain level just talking about indeterminate energies, and using words from the history of Western thought to try to get at those. and a category of Western thought which is much maligned, which is indeterminacy itself. I mean, you just historically, that's not a popular position, and very few people have held it. Mostly it's mocked, as I said. So I just wanted to make that clear how I'm using those terms. To me, they're all roughly kind of getting at the same thing.
I think too that like when you say the past is contained in the present, not only does this problematize our understanding of time, at least in the Kantian conception, which in a certain way, even in works like the Prolegomena to the History of the Concept of Time, Being in Time, these books that attempted to really try to escape the Kantian conception of time, still are highly dependent on the sort of first principles, or at least methodological principles that Kant lays out. Like we're still kind of trapped there, but we're also still sort of trapped in this game of potency. And I don't even think thinkers as radical as Deleuze even escape this conception of the virtual, in as much as the perpetual necessity to look at realization first and understand potency as that which is contained within either that which is actualized or realizable, or most importantly, determinable. Like we're trapped sort of in not just a cinematic conception of time, but a kind of cinematic ontology. like experience itself is so even like it's books like this that make me think like, oh my God, even the unconscious as a theater, the unconscious as a factory, like, you know, to excuse my French, but fuck, like we can't seem to escape this like machine that's puts things in and then other things come out on the other end of it. And if the past is contained in the present contained in the past, this the sort of siphoning off that we think we need to do in order to produce this thing we call determinacy has to, by nature, index movement, however we want to consider movement, the dissipation of energy, whatever it is. Because it seems like what's put at stake in books like The Philosophy of Movement is like the first principles of the first principle of philosophy. There's kind of an existential horror that's worse than any sort of Cthulhu I can think of, where not just my experience, but the ways in which I am told I experience are now no longer at least not stable, but even the ways in which we came to articulate those explanations have to be re-examined. So, you know, I'm reminded of a line, you know, from Foucault when he was getting criticized by some journalist. He's saying, you know, isn't it terrible to attest for the throwing away of an entire system? And he says, no, it takes a remarkable amount of courage to say we have to start over. It's books like this one that show us at least the kind of unraveling that takes place once our commitments shift ever so slightly. Like it's not like the claims made in this book have a sort of grandiosity to them. This, you know, this does have the humility, I think, of an academic text, and I don't mean academic as a slur here, although I usually do. The commitments are very humble, and yet everything from the way in which Alfred North Whitehead puts forward, or at least his interpreters put forward, the notion of process, to the conception of natural slavery, everything completely loses its either space in politics, its space in ontology, and these local discourses all become kind of muddled because they share this similar setting aside. So, you know, there is, I think, something rather horrifying about this book, much like the Lucretius one that we covered 2 years ago now. But yeah, so I appreciate that. So then the question on top of this Q&A style comment, I know SPEP just happened. The question on top of this huge comment is, you know, what are the sort of immediate political consequences for dealing with this question of movement as it pertains to the politics of place and the politics of what we call migration? Because I think that so much of what the the West has been using as sort of its sort of fascistic call to arms is this return to this conception of place, of a kind of identity that is lost through dissipation, whether it's the introduction of new populations or, you know, the loss of identity to, you know, the mobility of a mode of production, right? Like reactionaries too, you know, can claim benefits from whining about a particular mode of production. I think figures like Richard Spencer making, you know, TV ads about the violence of an American mall is a good indicator of this. But what is the consequence of changing our perception of movement, not just as an ontic or something to be dealt with, but in fact something rather primordial? I don't like that word either, because the primordial is in fact a part of the art of setting aside movement, right? What changes in the way we do politics when motion is entered into this question of the same, of the identical, of the represented?
Yeah, that's a big question. Depends how far we want to go back in history when we think about politics, since the books that I wrote sort of go all the way back to the Paleolithic and deal with different politics in different time periods. But maybe just a short thing about each or some of them anyway. The contemporary one being global migration. I mean, one important point, migration studies as an area of studies that I read for a while, it only goes back to usually about the collection, you know, 17th, 18th century max, but it's very deeply tied to the nation state and the rise of demography. Once you have people counting people, then you can get data. Other than that, you're sort of dealing with a different methodology, and sociologists kind of shy away from that. So they'd only go back so far. But when you go back far enough, and I mean far enough to like the Paleolithic, you see that human beings, just like other animals, move all over this planet. They always have, they always will. It's a constitutive part of what it means to be human on this planet, is to move around. Now, the tracking of those patterns is what the books have tried to show, is the moving around, the patterns generated by the moving around produce metastable states. Now, the danger is getting stuck in those metastable states. A book that I recently read, and I'm sure you all probably have too, is David Graeber's book, The Dawn of Everything. I was really sort of excited about, they don't develop it as much as one would like, but schismogenesis as a kind of anthropological principle, that like humans do all kinds of different things and they move around, but the question they say is like, well, schismogenesis, like they become different in response to each other, not by some essential feature of their language or their essence or their, you know, environment or something. These are all variables, but they also just want to be different. There's just sense that like organisms just try things out that are different, you know, not even if they're not quite as good or something. And his example is a snowshoe used by a different indigenous group, which was not as good as another snowshoe used by a different indigenous group, but it was their snowshoe. You know, that kind of schismogenetic response and differentiation for the sake of differentiation. If you start from the idea that human societies are, and my own addition here would be, if you're thinking about schismogenesis as a moving process of generating patterns, you're going to start to see all kinds of experimental branchings, just like you'd get in a language structure, like a family tree, genetics. You get these branches of differentiation. But then the question is, you really have to explain instead how people got stuck. And that's their reformulation of the problem of the history of human societies, is how'd they get stuck doing one thing, like the state? It emerged at a time, but then like, why did it keep going? Like we just kept doing it over and over and over again, that the state becomes somehow essential thing that has to be a part of human societies. But before it didn't. But so the question is like, why keep doing it? Why didn't we just be like, that was cool for a while, but it had some downsides. Let's do something else. And then you move on. Why did we get stuck? And of course, why get stuck in capitalism? Why get stuck in certain forms of agriculture? You know, that, you know, maybe, and their counter examples are really nice. And so you see in this book, the chapter I wrote on history is very much inspired by Dawn of Everything and thinking about, because I think it challenged, at least for me, some ways that I had thought about the history of politics and anarchism in particular, like what it means for societies to get stuck. So I had like, this is like kind of my answer to their question that I don't think they fully answered in that book. They say, oh, there's more books to come, but there won't be more books to come now, unfortunately. But that I was trying to give my answer to that question of how we get stuck. The patterns of motion start to kind of, you can't stop entropy, but you can slow it down relatively. You can speed it up, you can slow it down. You can distribute it differently. So I guess the answer is it changes the way we think about politics because it changes the question at issue, which is how do we get stuck in the state form? How do we get stuck in the capitalist form, given that everything is moving and everyone is moving around and there's all this micro differentiation? But how do the differentiations just like not make something new? And their contrast in both Paleolithic history and more sort of, more recent studies about indigenous populations is they had a very seasonal kind of politics. You have one politics in the winter, you have another in the summer, and you alternate and move around. So that's a very interesting idea to me, that you could have societies that sort of, it's, like tried things out for a while, and we might say, oh, but that was like kingship and authority. Yeah, but it was like, for them, there's a little bit of play involved, a little make believe, like, oh, this guy likes to think he's king. Let's let him do that for a while and have some fun games, and then the season's over and we'll move on, and then we'll pick somebody else next time. There's a kind of, a dynamism and an experimental character to that anthropology, that history of anthropology and that's kind of what I was thinking about in this book in particular, is like, there's all these patterns of motion. We have all these possibilities, but we get stuck in one of them for a really long time. How, why? And let's at least know that that's what we're doing and that we have sort of like got stuck there. What will it take to get out of it? I don't know in the future what it will take to get out of it, but in the past we can look back and see what it took for these things to shift and change. Anyway, the other just about migration is just to think about migration as a constitutive principle. That's the short political answer to that question. Is migration is not an aberration. It's not an exception to the rule of citizenship. It's a basic feature of human existence on the earth to move around variously. And so, and when it happens, it actually shapes societies. It doesn't just like arrive in a society, be like, oh, thanks for letting me be here. It changes that society and actually sort of either stabilizes it and reproduces it, or alters it in some significant way. And that I've tried to track in the history of migrations. They're constitutive in the way that these societies are even structured. So they owe everything to human mobility, and different names and so on get attached to different groups of people at different times and so on.
I think that's also part of the betrayal of our poor friend Diogenes. When he says, I'm a citizen of the cosmos, he doesn't mean, oh, I'm like a citizen of the stagnance of the cosmos. He's like, no, this concept of citizenship is ridiculous. I'm literally in the cosmos. What are you talking about? But now we're like, we are all global citizens. And what that means is we're all different shades of related to the United States of America. but yeah, I love that answer.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the lingering figure of the nomad, very much is pertinent here. And I'm not just doing that to import Deleuzianism, but mostly also to think about the way in which nomadism is kind of treated as a shameful thing, which has to be contained within certain circuits and sort of delimited in advance, insofar as it does kind of remind us that we might have to negotiate with the world to meet the universe halfway, as Karen Barad would put it, rather than the current sort of cybernetic model, which is kind of, well, it's not even cybernetic anymore. It's just it works because it works. I mean, at least the cybernetics of someone like Gregory Bateson, who formulates the concept of schismogenesis, would have to engage with this. But honestly, I mean, as we're coming towards the end, we're coming past the hour. I'd like to ask, what's next for philosophy of movement then? I mean, you've already created sort of an encyclopedic dictionary of movement. This is kind of this is an outline, and then of course you're working a lot more with anthropology and historical stuff. I'm assuming there's something like David Graeber, of course, and David Wengrow, but also I'm assuming stuff like like the class stress sort of stuff of trying to fend off the state. I mean, what's next for that? What's the next move, so to speak?
Yeah. So this book, the subtitle is, it's an introduction. The truth is, it's really a synthesis of everything I've done so far, especially the books that are like theory of such and such. As much as it's an introduction, it is sort of a conclusion. The philosophy of movement is I'm shifting gears. There won't be any more theory of books. This is sort of wrapping up like a decade-long investigation, mainly focusing on history as it leads up and through the Euro-Western tradition. But there is a very big shift that is happening, and I'm already working on a next whole series of books. So the next decade is more or less sort of carved out in my imagination of where this is all headed. But it started from just kind of wondering where Lucretius came from. Like, where did he get this idea of the swerve? I find it to be very anomalous that he has this position. To me, it's the most important idea inside the Western history is the idea of the swerve. Where's he getting this from? And he's got different sources. Okay, obviously Epicurus, but he's got poetic sources, Homer, Hesiod. He's reading the poets, and it led me back to those poets to think about what Lucretius might have been getting in his cosmogony from book 5, where he gives an account of the origin of the universe. It's very consistent with the idea of swerving of matter that sort of concretes into various, planets and things. But it led me to think quite much broader, not just about Homer and Hesiod, but about the pre-philosophical traditions around the world. And I won't get into the details, but I have basically found a group of texts which are the oldest primary native written texts in the world of cosmogony. So the oldest recorded native language cosmogonies in the world. There's way less of those than you might think. In the beginning, I thought this is too big. I can't possibly do all this. But then I realized there's actually not that many actual texts that were collected in the original language, but all of them begin with chaos. So the next series begins with chaos. And so the next book, which is done and it's under review right now, it's called The Birth of Chaos. And the idea is, importantly, it's connected with movement, but the next series is going to be on not the philosophy of movement, because this is before the philosophy. This is 6th century BCE and before, going back to 3rd millennium BCE. What do the oldest texts in the world say about movement? And, not to spoil too much here, but chaos, what we call chaos, that obviously only Hesiod is the one that uses that word, but essentially it's got these very common features across these texts around the world that I don't think can be explained by direct or even indirect influence. These are sort of spontaneous cosmogonies generated by different groups of people, all of which who place chaos at the very beginning. Some version, I'm calling it chaos because it's a shortcut here, at the very beginning of the cosmos. And that movement is always part of that. In the beginning, there's always movement, and everything comes out of that. So it's a very different orientation, and I'm even sort of struggling through because the typical vocabulary that I have, as I've learned as a philosopher, is no longer helpful to me and really feels inappropriate. Things like philosophy as a word, when it doesn't exist, when you're dealing with things that are thousands of years before the Greeks, why would you talk? They're not talking about philosophy. Why are you talking about philosophy? Why are you importing that word from? And what do you hope to be doing when importing and calling it Egyptian philosophy or something? Other words that aren't there are ontology, epistemology, for instance, about ancient Sumerian cosmogonies. Now, I know cosmogony is a Greek word. Of course, it's a mix of two, but they're at least better than ontology, I think, because it really is about birth. So the next series of books are going to be the birth, not the theory of, which is sort of inside the tradition that I started in, the Euro-Western tradition, but are very different than that. And they all distinctly have to do with birth. And that is a key feature that happens in the transition. That the project that I've just finished is birth is already out the window. Nothing happens by birth anymore. That's just not an appropriate way to think about things as they emerge. But before the 6th century BCE, that's how everything happens. Everything's born, and that everything dies. So everything's born from chaos, returns to chaos. And that, I think, really is maybe the single, I know I'm going to make a big statement here, but I'm working on, I think, a pretty good bit of evidence at this point that it's maybe the single most significant change in human history is the transition from stories where chaos comes first, primordially, and everything is born, to stories where order comes first and birth is a thing of the past, that things don't happen through birth. They happen through either craft or mental production or something like that. But the source of Genesis changes dramatically, and it produces philosophy. For instance, that shift, philosophy is predicated on the abolition of chaos. And that's, I hope you're already hearing some resonance. I mean, Deleuze has a similar kind of story when he's thinking about chaos.
Philosophy is the exclusion of
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I've sort of gone off the rails, I think, a bit.
No, that's
in this
our
project.
kind of this is super exciting stuff. We look forward to it.
Quentin Meillassoux, eat your fucking heart out. This is the proper hyper chaos coming here. It's okay. He probably isn't listening. You're like, Quentin, if you are listening, no, please get ready to translate the book on the non-existence or the inexistence of God, please. But assuming you're not listening, I do just want to say one final thing, which is, Thomas, thank you so much for coming back onto the show. The Philosophy of Movement and Introduction is out now. It came out last month from the University of Minnesota Press. And again, cheers to the folks at Minnesota for sending us this book. Also, the foreword by Daniel Smith. Of course, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us again, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.